and welcome to the 10th session of the GTAP conference, which will be about, as you know, modeling the impact of the African Continental Free Trade Area on food systems and sustainable resources. I've seen that this year in GTAP there are many sessions dedicated to the African Continental Free Trade Area. So this is one of some. But it's I think it's very interesting to follow, and the content will for sure will be very relevant for the discussion around the free trade Africa free trade area. So let me introduce rapidly our speakers that I welcome, and I can also see some of them. I only miss I think Victor. Victor, if you can show up as well, so I can introduce all of you. So the first speaker will be Antti Simola for the European Commission in the Joint Research Center, and the speech will be about the food security dimension of the African Continental Free Trade Area. So today we are focusing on the food parts, so that's what we are talking about across all the session. Antti is an environmental and natural resource economist with experience in agriculture economics in using CG model and econometrics. He has completed his PhD degree in the Faculty of Agriculture and Forestry in Helsinki. Before joining the Jersey, he was a senior researcher at the VATT Institute for Economic Research. And in his presentation, he will analyze the trade agreements looking at food security, employing the CG called magnets. With the model, the study simulated an explicit trajectory of reduction in tariffs and non-tariff measures. So this will be the main interest of this of his presentation. Then we will follow with Caitlin Carrico from the Wageningen Economic Research Group, and the presentation will be about disaggregating underlying drivers of fruits and vegetables trade, so a focus on these parts of the food sector, with an HS level modeling analysis of the African Free Trade Agreement. She's an economist at the Wageningen Economic Research. She has extensive experience in trade issues. In fact, she is also co-author of the following presentation. Before joining Wageningen Economic Research, she worked for the OECD and also for the GTAP centers, among others. She has a PhD from Purdue University on international trade. In her presentations, she will then present a scenario still with magnets, capturing the realism of trade structure by modeling trade at the HS6 level. Then we will have Jason Levin-Koopman. He's a colleague of Caitlin, and he will talk about the advent of the African Continental Free Trade Area, new possibilities and implications for the African land, water, climate, food nexus. So here we are focusing more on the environmental aspects. He's as well an economist at the Wageningen Economic Research and has extensive experience in water issues applied to CG models. He has also a PhD from the Institute for Environmental Studies and from the University of Amsterdam on water allocation as an adaptation measure to climate change. So he will present this analysis about the African Continental Trade Agreement, again performed with magnets, looking at the water, land, climate, food nexus point of view. And then finally, last but not least, we will have Victor Nikifor, again from the Joint Research Center, which will focus a little bit on one country, which is Kenya. So it will present effects of trade liberalization in Kenya. He is an environmental resource economist with experience in water economics and CG modeling. Victor has also completed a PhD at the University College London Institute for Sustainability Resources. And before joining the Jersey, he was also a research associate at UCL. In this presentation, we will employ a technique to feed the results from magnets, again, into a fully disaggregated single country CG model called Dimitra, to offer a detailed characterization of the economic impacts of the African continental free trade area in Kenya in a number of areas, from the macroeconomic, sectoral, and more at microeconomic level, at household level, household welfare. So I think I said everything, but I couldn't present myself. My name is Giampiero Genovese. I am head of unit in the Joint Research Center. So basically, Antti and Victor are colleagues in my unit. And I also know very well colleagues from Wageningen, because we have a long story of cooperation with them, especially with magnets. And in fact, we are not focusing about the African continental free trade area, but we're also focusing on how to use the magnet model. And this is what will be about the presentations we are going to listen to. So I think we can start straight ahead. So the first will be Antti. If you can upload your presentation, Antti.
Thank you, Giampiero.
And the floor is yours. Just a few rules we are going to follow. First of all, we have to unmute all of us while listening to Antti. And for the questions, we will wait the end of the session. And please write the question in the chat. Thank you.
So thank you and good afternoon, everybody. So my presentation, it's about the effects that AfCFTA will have on agriculture and food security in Africa. And my co-authors in this paper are Emanuele Ferrari, Ule Boysen, Victor Nikifor, and Pierre Boulanger, all from the JRC Seville, except Pierre, who used to be with us, but is now at the CR Rome. So the African Continental Free Trade Area was launched at the start of this year with almost all the African countries participating. Only Eritrea is still outside of it. And that makes it the largest free trade area at the moment when measured in the number of participating countries. The Union considers it as the flagship project in the economic integration of African countries. There are several objectives that I have listed here. Creation of a single market for goods and services in Africa, and allowing free movement of people and investments, and promotion of intra-African trade between and beyond the existing regional economic communities, and improvement of competitiveness and facilitation of economic transformation. So the economic prospects of Africa in overall have been promising. Both economic and population growth have been strong in the pre-pandemic era. So Africa has a lot of potential to become a prominent part of global economy. The better integration of African economies is a key in this process, because as a hindrance, thus far the majority of African trade happens between African and non-African countries. And trade is also mostly on low value-added products like agricultural commodities and natural resources. And the AfCFTA is hoped to both increase the volumes of inter-African trade and increase its value-added share. There are already quite several economic studies on this topic. I have listed some of them here. And they all use CG models, but also they vary in a great many details. For example, the earliest studies, they could not take into account the extent of the agreement and detailed plans of the implementation that have become available more recently. Still, the main message from these studies is that the AfCFTA will benefit the African nations due to increased economic activity, and in particular due to increased intra-African trade. And our study here, it takes a more detailed look on agriculture and food security issues than previous studies, and it is also up to date with respect to the implementation of the agreement. On this slide, I have a small comparison of these previous studies, and they have many things in common. First, they saw that GDP increases moderately at the African Union level, around a few percents after transition period of more than 10 years. Second commonality is that the majority of the GDP increase comes from the NTM reduction, while the effects of the tariff cuts are quite modest. And our study, which I have listed here in the bottom of the table, it represents the lower end of the GDP improvement. And I have a similar table here about trade. Trade volumes in these studies, and they saw that African countries increased their trade as expected due to AfCFTA. Also, as with GDP, our study indicates a lower increase in total trade volumes than the previous studies. And there is one possible explanation for this discrepancy between our study and the previous studies is that our study is the far most detailed study on sectoral level, since we use aggregation of 40 sectors and commodities. And for example, the World Bank study that most closely resembles our study on other aspects has only 20 sectors in total. So some of the discrepancy can be explained by aggregation bias. So to the method, as I mentioned, we are using a CG model here. Sorry, that's namely the magnet model that is developed at Wageningen Economic Research. And the version that we used in this study takes the version 6 of the GTAP model and version 10 of the GTAP database as its starting point. And it has recursive dynamics in it, and it has a modular structure which allows the model to be used flexibly in different questions. And it is a very, very widely used model in several studies dealing with agriculture and food policies by several institutions. So, because there's a considerable regional variation within Africa, we aim to have as much regional detail as possible in the model. And these two maps here summarize the regional aggregations we used. On the left-hand side, we see the regional aggregation of the model simulations. And the dark red countries, there they are modeled as individual countries, and the rest are as regional aggregates. With a few exceptions, this is the most detailed aggregation of African countries available in the version 10 of the GTAP database. There's 36 regions in total in our simulations, and 29 of them are African. On the right-hand side, then there's aggregation of regional economic communities, which we use mainly in communicating the results. It should be noted that our aggregation here, it deviates on a few points on the actual RECs because of some overlapping between them and GTAP aggregation of some regions. So this is a dynamic CG study. So we have a baseline, and we present our results as a deviation, percentage deviations from the baseline. And our baseline is based on SET Socioeconomic Pathways 2, which is a middle of the road projection, and we started from 2020. And the baseline takes GDP and population growth from these projections and accommodates exogenous factor used to them. GTAP base data is for 2014, and this pre-policy period, which is between the start of the AfCFTA and the base data, we take that from the IMF's World Economic Outlook data. And that way our policy starting point corresponds as closely as possible to the real data. In the policy simulations, we project several scenarios of the implementation of the AfCFTA, and the time frame is between 2020 and 2035 when the agreement is fully implemented. And we consider two policy changes. First, the tariff cuts, and then combined tariff cuts and reduction of non-tariff measures. And for calculating the tariff cuts, we used MacMaps data at the HS6 level, and they take into account the modalities that the countries have. For example, there is more protection allowed for sensitive products and the least developed countries. And based on that, we consider 5 separate scenarios that are based on maximization of tariff revenue. And these are hypothetical scenarios, and the actual ones will be available quite soon. So the first scenario, it's just assumes maximization of tariff revenues, and in addition to that, there are 3 alternatives for that one that reflect various economic policy interests. First is liberalization of agriculture and food industries in order to improve access to food. Second is liberalizing of trade on intermediates in order to promote industrialization. And then third one is the promotion of industries that have revealed a comparative advantage. Finally, there's a last one which aims to take into account that it's unlikely that all African countries would follow uniformly the same strategy. And we consider an approach where the countries choose the one from the aforementioned strategies that maximizes their GDP. The next to the NTMs, we consider a gradual reduction of the trade restrictions that sum up to 50% of the total. So the NTMs will be halved, and that applies to all the imports that come to Africa, also from the non-African countries. In addition to that, we assume that the exports from Africa have a 20% NTM reduction due to general harmonization of the NTMs. In magnitude, our NTM assumptions, they are in line with the recent World Bank study, but we have one twist concerning the modeling the NTMs, because we use a mixed approach where we allocate NTMs in either productivity costs, iceberg costs, and ad valorem equivalent effects. And for that, we have assumed that sanitary and phytosanitary measures and technical measures are not rent generating, and therefore we model them as iceberg costs. And the remaining NTMs we model as ad valorem equivalents. And it's good to know that at this point that it is definitely the trickiest part to model, because there's so much uncertainty how the NTMs will turn out in the AfCFTA. So next I can go to the results, and I saw first some macro level results. And in these figures, I present percentage changes with respect to baseline in these bar charts at the left-hand side. They have both tariff cuts and combined tariff and NTM cuts shown at the REC level. And all these results are presented in real terms. And we can see the total effect at the African Union level in the first bar on the left. And on the right-hand side, there is a map for a more detailed regional level results for the combined tariff and NTM reductions. And in these charts, I have included only basic tariff revenue maximization scenario. So this slide is for the GDP results, how they look in our simulations. And as I mentioned earlier, the GDP increases at the African Union level rather moderately. When compared to previous studies, it's about a 0.6% increase. But the results are positive throughout for all of the regions, and the highest increase we see that happens in the rest of the Western Africa region. Next slide, I show how these different scenarios turn out. These are tariffs plus combined tariffs and NTM reductions for the 5 different tariff scenarios. And we see that the scenarios with the uniform choices are very similar. And it is interesting to note that when countries are able to choose the one that maximizes their GDP, the results are somewhat higher or lower, and much more higher than would have been just a simple summation of the GDP effects. Next, I go to the trade, and here we see the total trade effects, and on imports, and imports increase about 4% at the African Union level and all over the Africa. And they are about the same level all over with a few exceptions. Next, when we turn into the intra-African imports, we see that the AfCFTA really promotes the trade between African countries. The majority of the increase in imports comes from within the African Union. The total increase is almost 20% at the end of the transition period. We see that CEMAC and ECOWAS are the ones that increase the imports from Africa most.
Antti, possibly 3 minutes. 3 minutes,
3 minutes.
Antti, possibly, yeah.
Okay, I will move to the food security results in that case. So on the first slide, I have disposable income, which is perhaps the best macro level indicator of food security. And this is how it looks out in our simulations. In general, the disposable incomes do increase. And on the African Union level, the increase is higher than than GDP. And it is nevertheless interesting to note that some regions we see negative results, and they happen mostly in regions that are most dependent on the output of natural resources such as oil. And CEMAC is a good example of such region. When the exports of resources increase in these countries, the income shift from labor to capital, which reduces the disposable part of it. And a more direct indicator of food security is food consumption, which we see that it increases in all scenarios, and highest increases we see in CEMAC. On the next slide, I have these different scenarios, and we see that this scenario that promotes agricultural liberalization that yields the best outcome for food consumption. Primary agricultural production, we see here that the effects are quite moderate. In many regions, it actually decreases. And we have a similar figure for the processed food production, and that net effect is actually negative. So when the increased food consumption does not come from domestic production, the imports have to increase, and that's what we see here in this slide. They increase quite moderately for primary agricultural products, but much more pronounced in processed foods. Thus, the results indicate that due to AfCFTA, African consumers will consume more food that is increasingly imported and also more highly processed. Finally, I have here a slide on food prices. They decrease slightly in many regions, which indicates that AfCFTA helps to make food available to lower income groups as well. So the conclusions with this study, we've seen that overall effects of the AfCFTA are positive on food security. We see food consumption increasing throughout, and food prices decrease in most of the regions. But we also see that production will be more regionally concentrated by commodities. Some countries even move to produce other stuff than food. Food imports will increase mostly within Africa, and we saw that especially the resource-rich countries will become more dependent on the imports. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Antti. Very, very interesting. We have time for a couple of questions. And the first one comes from Dainong. He thanks you, of course, for your nice presentation and work, Antti. He congratulates you. And the question is, do you use any specific sectoral projections like output growth, productivity, and technology developments or other, and inflation rates along with the SSP2 baseline assumptions?
Well, we don't use strictly sectoral projections, but we have productivity improvements for land, so that's restricted to those sectors that use land. But otherwise, everything is macro projections. Okay,
I have myself a question, Antti. I see that, in fact, some of the countries are overlapping as far as the regional economic community are considered. So, how do you see this about the effects of the African trade? Are there indirect effects that should be taken into account, doubling maybe the effects in a country, or changing these effects because of belonging of different at the same time to different regional community?
As far as I understand, they will be harmonized at the REC level. So I think they will become more even across our RECs. So I think that's I think the differences between RECs will be a smaller effect in the future.
Okay. So I don't see any other questions. If you want to, yes, Caitlin, what precisely was driving the differences between 5 different scenarios? Slide 13, specifically. The one on the GDP.
Yes, you probably mean the last one, why it is different. These differences are small because for the first 4, because they add up to the same sum at the macro level. But the last one, I think it allows better allocation of resources between countries, and that's why it's a higher GDP improvement.
Okay, a question from Charlotte. Do you know why implementing solely the tariff reduction increases the food prices slightly in most regions?
I don't have an answer for that because we mostly concentrated on this NTM scenario. So that's a good question. That's something we could take a more closer look. So
other question from Sarah Saibzada. Hope I'm pronouncing well. How did you change the closure in your model?
We didn't change. It's basically the default closure in the magnet model that we use. So there is a rate of return that will adjust that at the global level for capital flows.
A question from Onur Bijik that is about the Tms Shock. That shock directly creates productivity shock and thereby boosts real GDP growth considerably. So how do you control this, especially using WB assumptions?
Do you mean this iceberg cost? Because we have this mixed approach to modeling NTMs both. I think you are referring to that. Well,
Onur, you want to show up and clarify?
Hello, thank you for the your simulation, Antti. Just like there is a study about Wellesley. I think she's comparing comparing like import like related AMC trade costs and export related like different instruments. Yeah. She's trying to contract. So since you're relying on the WTO and World Bank assumption, is quite strong, right? That's they use the heavy assumption, and it's probably differentiate between the tariff and non-tariff like output. How do you control just the? Thank you.
Actually, we don't use World Bank assumption. World Bank used only tariff equivalent and valorem equivalents of tariffs, and so our approach is more detailed because we take into account that some of the NTMs might not be rent generating that we allocate to iceberg cost. But yeah, I'm aware of that new study that you could also apply NTMs to export side, and we haven't done it here. It's something that we could think about in the future development of this study.
Okay, thank you, Antti. I think this was the last question we can get on board. So we will smoothly go to the next presentation. For the time being, Antti, congratulations and thank you for your presentation. And I presume you will be available, of course, for any bilateral questions that people in this session might have.
Sure.
So let's go for the next presentation. Kathleen, the floor is yours. Tell us everything about the drivers for fruits and vegetables in these agreements. We cannot hear you, Kathleen. You should unmute.
Sorry, once I shared it, everything disappeared and I hadn't unmuted yet. So let me try that again.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, there we go. I think you can see the screen and I will present this. Okay, can you see everything clearly?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you also very much for the very nice introduction. So as mentioned, today I'm presenting our report entitled Disaggregating Underlying Drivers of Fruit and Vegetables Trade, an HS level modeling analysis of the AfCFTA. And this is joint work with my colleagues David Cooey and Andre Tabot. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy and trade context. We heard about this before, so I won't go into too many details. So again, we're looking at the African Continental Free Trade Area. This came into effect very recently, in the 1st of January of this year, and so far, the numbers I could find show that 36 of the countries have ratified the agreement. Now, we are anticipating that there's going to be significant effects for agriculture as this trade agreement is anticipated to boost interregional trade and integration. Agriculture is an important sector. In some countries, it can be, say, 30-40% of the GDP, Though it's also important in the sense that it employs a significant proportion of the working population across the continent. It's about 60%, and it can be more in certain countries. Now, we are looking at 7 different regions. So we're looking at COMESA, EAC, ECCAS, ECOWAS, UMA, and the SADC. And we also additionally break out the West African Economic and Monetary Union. This map here shows that there's shows the distinction there. And we'll talk a little bit about why. So just to talk about why we broke out these regions, especially the Monetary Union of West Africa and ECOWAS, this is because of the significant amount of sort of trade between these countries within each region, and we wanted to look at that sort of inter-regional trade. Now, again, this is just the basic intercontinental trade among all 7 sources and destinations. And we see, of course, that most of the trade is within region, if we look across the diagonal. However, across regions, SADC is a very important, they're important exporters, so they're an important supplier to the other regions. So they're quite important for the intercontinental trade. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology. So we also use the magnet model. So this is the model that Antti provided a very nice description of. So it's a GTAP-based model, and we have modular additions. So the core is the GTAP core, and if we want to develop something specifically, say to look at SDGs or water, then we have modules that add on to this GTAP core. So for this report, what we did is we developed a new magnet HS module. This HS module is based on the GTAP version 7 HS model. Now, this GTAP, the special version of the GTAP model, is a hybrid GTAP modeling system, which can be used to really look at trade at the harmonized system level. So looking at those HS line trade flows and also tariffs. So we adapted this GTAP model into a module for the magnet model. And what we can do with this is that for a given GTAP level commodity, we can disaggregate this into these HS level commodities. We can do this at the HS6 or the HS4 level. Here we're going to do it at the HS6 level. There are certain changes that happen to the theory of the standard model. So the model is adapted theoretically. So for example, now you have this arming to nesting. So you have the sourcing decision at the HS level commodities, at the HS level for those commodities that we've split out into the HS level. And in addition, we also have a regional super agent that is making the decision for domestic and imported goods. And then this is allocated across the individual agents. So this now means that there's a homogeneous price of domestic or imported goods for a certain commodity across agents, so across the household, producers, and investment. Okay, so the scenario design, so we are testing a bit this new module. So we're implementing the new module to analyze the AfCFTA, and we're also testing it against the standard model. So we're looking at the difference that having this HS level module, how that affects the scenario outcomes. And of course, we have our AfCFTA scenario set up. So we took we do really an illustrative scenario. So we don't have as much detail, for example, as anti-scenario does. So we're doing a comparative static scenario. And we are also, our focus is on fruits and vegetables. So this is the commodity in the standard GTAP database and in the magnet database. This is the commodity we have that we chose to break out to the HS level. And there's 105 HS6 codes that are grouped within fruit and vegetables. So now instead of having fruit and vegetables as an aggregate commodity, we have these 105 HS6 lines. And we do a very basic, I'm sorry, I think I just got kicked off. Can you still see?
Go ahead and reshare, Caitlin.
Okay. Okay, can you see this again? Okay, thank you. So we implement a basic trade liberalization scenario. So we're looking at zero tariffs. And in part, this is also because we really want to focus on the differences, sort of the benefits that this new HS module brings, in the fact that now we can have heterogeneous tariff shocks across these 105 HS6 tariff lines. So this is the basic setup that we have. And now I will go into the results. So first, we're going to sort of look at the TMS shock. So this is really the tariff shock, the shock used to calculate zero tariffs, which is applied under the model, the sort of standard magnet model, so without the HS scenario. So this is just to get an idea. And these are the tariffs for this fruit and vegetable sector. What we're going to focus on later on, so keep in mind, but I'll also show you again, is the changes in tariffs. You can see that they can be really relatively quite high. And we're especially interested in these important changes that SADC is facing as an exporter to all the importing destination regions. So it's really facing quite similarly high tariffs. And this is important, again, considering that SADC is one of the most important exporters across the continent. Okay, so don't worry, there's a lot of numbers, but I'm going to walk you through it just to give an overview. So now what this table is showing is the TMSK shocks. So these are the tariff shocks at the HS level in the HS module. And basically what this table is here to do is to illustrate that once we have the HS level module, now we're looking across the tariff lines, and you can have some cases where there's quite some variation. So this is only looking at the first 10 HS codes, HS6 codes. And again, recall there's 105. So you can see that there's variation here, and you can imagine that there's even more variation. And this is important that these shocks are more precise, because now our trade information that we have is also more precise at this tariff line and across these different importers. And again, this is also just for SADC, which is why I put at the bottom row here, I put what the previous TMS shock that was for that aggregate commodity. So you can really see how much these HS6 specific tariff shocks differentiate from what we had before. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the comparative macroeconomic results in terms of GDP results. So we see that for the most part, the GDP results from, again, we're looking at tariff shocks alone, are across the board, they're relatively muted because the highest shocks are less than 0.5%. And again, this also has a bit to do with what we're looking at. We're just looking at the tariff shock. So we're just looking at the removal of tariffs. Whereas what we know, and Andrew touched upon this a bit in his prior simulation, is that some of the greatest gains in terms of GDP are expected to come from looking at decreasing non-tariff barriers and increasing trade facilitation, which we aren't modeling here again because we want to focus on the introduction of heterogeneous tariffs. Okay, so also, now if we look at the comparison between the HS module and sort of the standard module without HS, the HS module scenarios shows relatively lower GDP gains for most countries, with the exception of SADC and UMA. And we'll talk a little bit about that. Okay, and also we can look at the production results. Okay, and here we see that actually production is mostly declining, except for SADC and also COMESA. So the COMESA has very, very slight positive production. So what we do see, though, again, is that the results are less pronounced with the HS module. Okay. And we can also look at the difference in sort of aggregate imports. So we aggregate up across the 105 different HS lines. We aggregate the trade flows in terms of the imports. And then we look at the difference between the HS and the model without the HS module. And we see that there's quite some important differences, and especially for SADC. And keep in mind, again, SADC was a major exporter. So what you're looking here, when you see this line, it's the exports coming from SADC. So we see across the board, there's the biggest difference between the models in terms of this major exporter. So this difference really has to do, well, all these differences that we're observing really have to do sort of with differences between the HS module, the model with the HS module, and the standard model without the HS module. And again, the differences are that we have the tariff shock at the HS level versus the aggregate GTAP level. We also have so we have the underlying value of trade from SADC is very important. So therefore the distinctions are going to be magnified. And I should say we also have the differences in terms of the trade, not just the tariff shocks, but we have the differences in terms of the trade flows distributed across the HS lines versus in one aggregate commodity. And we also have this different theoretical structure where you have the source union decision at the HS6 level. And then we also have the introduction of the super agent. So you have the homogeneous prices across importing agents. Okay. So another, so these are this slide kind of highlights where these differences are coming from. But what I would like to say is that also there's a good reason to think that even though these are sort of dampened effects, there are reasons to think that this might very well be more realistic in another sense too. And I'm also going to now give sort of more specific example with SADC of the granularity that you can see in terms of the results. And this will really also demonstrate sort of the realism that we now have in the model with the HS module. So what I've done here is selected the 6 most exported fruit and vegetable commodities, of course at the HS6 level. So exported from the SADC to the other countries within the continent. So it's just intracontinental trade. And you can see we have a variety of different commodities. We have potatoes, onions, plantains, oranges, grapes, and apples. And okay, so here we can actually see in the base data what is the relative, what is the underlying trade for these different commodities. So this is just to give background. This is before we apply the tariff removal, just to see how important are these different commodities for the importers that are importing fruit and vegetables from SADC. And
2 minutes, Caitlin.
Okay, thank you. You can see there's quite some variety. You can also see that this last one, apples, is very important, and also grapes is a bit important too. Okay, now these are the tariff level shocks, and you can see that now for some countries we don't have much variation, but for other countries such as regions, such as UMA and COMESA and SADC, we have quite a bit of variation. So now we're looking, once we do the liberalization, now we're looking at the sort of 2 components, the fact that we have varying tariffs and we have varying underlying trade flows as well. And so now it should be no surprise that we also get greater variation in terms of changes to the import quantity across the individual HS codes. This is percent changes, but now we can look at the million US dollars. So these are real changes. And we again see that there's quite a lot of variety depending on the importer and also depending on the product. And we again see that apples are very popular. So just very quickly, some conclusions. So again, we have these muted results when we look at the tariff removal only, especially, I say muted in terms of the macroeconomic, really the GDP results that we're getting. We would anticipate, if we also look at changes in non-tariff barriers and improvements in trade facilitation, that this would amplify the results that we're seeing. Also, if we had access to a market access schedule and we're looking at changes in the market access schedules, then we could really implement this differentiation of tariff rejection at the HS line, whereas right now we're just doing, a standard 100% tariff reduction. Now, again, the HS module results appear to be less pronounced than the standard model. And especially if you look at differences in terms of GDP, production, and trade. And again, this has to do, well, with the theoretical difference in terms of the super agent, but also that now the model has more realism in terms of the trade structure as it captures the heterogeneity at the HS level. Of course, depending on the sector that you're really interested in, this module really can offer the benefit of having a higher degree of granularity. And we saw this looking at the exports from SADC in terms of you can now see what are the biggest trading partners and in what products in particular. And we saw that was apples. So that is it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. Very interesting. And thank you for being in time, exactly in time.
Okay, great.
We have, that's perfect. Now we have like about 10 minutes of discussion. So please post your questions or if you want to take the floor.
Okay, so I see.
Yeah, a question from Honor. Would you like to read it yourself, Caitlin, or I do it for you?
As you like. I don't know what you prefer.
Okay, just for a matter of let's say, in the meanwhile, you can think about the answer. Okay. So, Honor is thanking you for the excellent presentation. I agree with, of course. I might have missed the explanation of the HS and non-HS, which have a different impacts on outputs. The non-magnet model could not capture the reality of FTA.
Okay, so I think these are sort of two different questions, I would say. So in terms of the impact on output, so there were significant differences in terms of what I showed both GDP and production, and that's right. And as I mentioned before, this is related to a couple different things. So this is related to the fact that you have the more specific trade structures. So now that you're doing this liberalization with this more specific trade structure, in a sense, it's more restrictive for the model because you have smaller trade flows. So you have less of an ability for countries sort of to change their sourcing choices. And now that can happen, but only on a very small trade flow compared with a much bigger trade flow when you had trade just for fruit and vegetables. So that's the introduction of the trade structure, which has an effect. And the other thing that we change again is there's a super agent now. So you you have the sourcing at the HS6 level. The individual agents, so the producers, consumers, the investor, these agents are no longer making the decision to use an imported product or, sorry, just saw another one, an imported product or domestic product. So now there's also a homogeneous price for the agents. So those are two different reasons that there are these differences between the models. We've thought of ways that we could try to sort of sparse out the differences, but we haven't done that experiment yet. But those are the two factors which account for those differences. Now, in terms of your second question, which is capturing the non-magnet, okay, I think you mean the non-HS module. So what I was saying, yes, I mean, all models are models, so we're all capturing varying degrees of reality when we're looking at a free trade agreement. But what I was saying is, in a sense, it goes back to what I was saying about introducing, more realistic trade structure. So, for example, when you have fruit and vegetables as one commodity, then you're making sourcing decisions just for that commodity. Now, if you break it out to the HS6 level, you know, you are now either looking at apples or oranges, but you're not looking at apples and oranges together. And there are certain places where, you know, you're only going to produce one type of crops or in certain regions and not in other regions. Yeah, so it captures just another degree of reality. Of course, then there's also concessions that you make in a sense, because now we have a super agent. So it just depends on what you want to prioritize in your study.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. I think you were very exhaustive in the explanation. Now there is a question from Sarah. She would like to know more about the harmonized system codes with GTAP. So what is the, how did you use them with GTAP? Can you explain the method?
That's a good question. So thank you for that question. So I think maybe I can discuss it on two different levels. So on the one level, well, there's the data source. So we're using the TASE data source. So this has the trade information mapped to the GTAP sectors. So we use this. But as I mentioned before, also the model is quite heavily modified as well. So the first thing is the database. So we're using the taste information, so the trade flows and the tariffs from taste, which are at the HS level, and that's concorded with the GTAP sectors. And then we also have these HS level sectors within the model as well. So I hope that answers that.
I hope so. And now there is a question from Oli. It's about the elasticity mainly. So in East, or maybe you didn't mention how you use elasticity and what is the nesting below the GTAP sectors is used. And then what are the plans in terms of elasticity for the future? I think this will be the last question to guarantee a smooth transition to the next. So go ahead, Caitlin.
Okay, thank you. So in terms of our elasticities, these are really just the standard elasticities that are already there in the GTAP model. In terms of the nesting, yeah, I did mention now that the nesting is a bit changed because we have, we're using the Armington elasticities at the HS level. And then also we have the elasticity for the super agents. So normally you have the elasticity between foreign and domestic, that choice and that elasticity at the individual agents like the household or the consumer and the different producers. And now we don't. So, well, it's the same elasticity, but now we just have that nesting at the regional level at a super agent level. So that brings a really pertinent question, because you say, what are the plans? So we haven't made any concrete plans, but there's certainly a lot that you could explore there in terms of thinking about, well, now that you have HS6 level commodities, what is a more appropriate elasticity that you might want to introduce there. So there's definitely a lot of things to explore.
Thank you, Kathleen, and congratulations for your work. I think we can stop here for this discussion session. And so I invite Jason now to take the floor. Jason Levin-Kubman. I hope I'm pronouncing well your family name, Jason.
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, you're also from the same research group in Wageningen, and you will tell us everything about the nexus. Where for nexus you mean the relationship between the water, the foods, the land, and what I'm missing. Jason?
Some greenhouse gas emissions.
And climate. So
that's right.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just jump into share the presentation. Okay, can you all see this?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm seeing a couple of nods. Great. Yes, I'm Jason Koopman, and this is I'm going to present also on the AfCFTA with focusing on the environmental and other aspects, and also mostly as well food security and these impacts for food security. I'm doing this together with Caitlin Carrico, the previous presenter, and also Benedetta Olsen. And Caitlin and I are from the same institute in the Netherlands, Wageningen Economic Research, and Benedetta is from the Technical University of Turin. Many of these of the presentations are all introducing the same things. We're using the Magnet model to explore the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And here we have the same division of African regions as Caitlin as well, but with the addition of splitting out Burkina Faso to look at the impacts then on an individual country. So that is the little green speck in the middle of the pink on the left-hand side. Here's now my brief introduction of the AfCFTA. It's been said before. The focus here as well, we focus a bit more on agriculture as well, which is of course a major employer, and that's particularly the case for Burkina Faso. So again, we are all introducing the Magnet model in a slightly different way, which is good. That this my introduction is mostly in pictures. So the Magnet model is a modular CVE model. It's based on GTAP with all sorts of additions that we can sort of plug and play. So we can use various pieces to suit the problem that we are looking at. So the additions to the model that we're using here are an addition that allows us to examine irrigation water, as well as greenhouse gas emissions and nutrition and food consumption. Again, how does Magnet work? This is what others have said, but now I'm doing this in pictures, where we start in the top left corner, where we have the GTAP model, and we add additional necessary data sets and modules. And then we run the model several times for several periods. So in this case, it is only twice for 2 different periods, from 2014 to 2020, and then further to 2030. And the first time is without any additional policies. So this is then the baseline business as usual, without the introduction of the AfCFTA policies. And this is then the baseline, and this also follows the standard SSP2, which is exogenous changes to GDP population. And we allow productivity growth then to meet we allow productivity to grow endogenously to meet these GDP projections. Then once you have the baseline, we turn it around, and the productivity changes over time are then exogenous, allowing the policies to affect GDP changes. Population remains exogenous. Then we have this policy scenario, which is run in the 2020 to 2030 period, where we implement the AfCFTA. And in this case, the AfCFTA is much more simple than the previous few presentations. We are only focusing on tariff reduction, so it's much more basic. So a little bit more into the scenarios that we are running. So we have, again, the baseline business as usual until 2030 without the AfCFTA. Then on top of this, we implement the AfCFTA tariff reductions, and we're again looking at Africa as a whole, these different regions, but Burkina Faso in particular. Then we have another scenario of expanding irrigated area in Burkina Faso. This is a hypothetical scenario of doubling irrigated area for most crops, and we only do this for crops that are currently both irrigated and have rain-fed production. So if in our database a crop is only in rain-fed production, then we don't increase irrigation, or if it is fully irrigated, like sugarcane production in our database, then we also do not increase irrigated areas. So the primary beneficiary of this is actually rice production. So the big changes will come from an increase in rice production to this scenario in Burkina Faso. And then finally, we don't run the scenario, but we examine the impact of these policies on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. So these are the baseline food security trends for the different regions. BFA is Burkina Faso, so that is the region, that is the country we're paying most attention to. And this is the percent change in the business as usual scenario for the 2020 to 2030 period. And so these are the four food security indicators we're looking at: disposable income per capita, average food prices, the share of expenditure in food expenditure in total disposable income, and the food consumption per capita. And these are what you're looking at. These numbers are just the percent change. These aren't the full numbers. These are the percent change in this period. And the most important message of this slide, most obvious, is that everything is moving in the right direction. So without exploring these policies, just in the baseline, all these regions are getting more wealthy. Food prices are decreasing. The share of their total income spent on food is decreasing, and food consumption is increasing. So without looking at these at any additional policies, things are moving in the right direction, and that's because people are getting richer. So now moving into looking at the impact of these tariff reductions on GDP. But again, this is solely tariff reductions, not any other policies. For most regions that we're looking at, this increases GDP. For a few, COMESA and ECCAS, it decreases, and this has to do with the relative gains which come from these tariff reductions. So for COMESA in particular, there are relatively few current import tariffs from other regions onto the COMESA regions, and there's much higher import tariffs that the COMESA region imposes on others. So this tariff reduction then increases the possibilities for the competition, and then relative disadvantage. But this is sort of a side story. The main story is that there's an increase in GDP for most regions, including Burkina Faso. So this is we see this slide shows the changes in macro trade patterns. The top left is for primary agricultural products, and the bottom right is for the non-agricultural products. And so we see for the top right, exports outside. So this is what happens then is there's a shift in trade from external to within Africa. So the exports decrease. There's still a slight increase in imports from outside of Africa, again due to increased demand. And then there's an increase in trade within Africa, and this is the some similar for industry, where also imports decrease externally. So it's even a higher shift to within. So how does this tariff reduction then impact the same food security indicators? This is different for different regions. For all regions, starting at the column on the right, food consumption per capita increases for all regions. For most regions, then going back to the left, disposable income increases for most regions, and its food prices also increase. And so it's a bit of a wash which one increases more. So the share of food expenditure in total disposable income can go up or down depending on which is rising more. In Burkina Faso, the share, disposable income per capita rises due to these tariff reductions. Average food prices rise even more in percent change terms, and the share of food in total expenditure then also rises, even though of course food consumption rises. So it's this interaction, and particularly the share of food expenditure and total disposable income, that's worth paying attention to, as of course these are average for the region. So if we were to then look at individual income classes, this would be something to pay attention to. So now going back to the trade story, but now looking particularly at Burkina Faso, where the blue is the AfCFTA tariff reduction only, and the yellow is not only is the tariff reduction and also an increase in irrigation from this policy. So you see, as expected, increased irrigation leads to higher domestic production and consumption. This reduces imports. So we have a smaller increase in imports of primary agriculture from within Africa, and this further reduces the imports from outside of Africa, and slightly relatively increases the exports outside of Africa as well. And then because this is only focused on an efficiency gain in agriculture, it has no change or very little change in industry trade, which is the same behavior as for Africa in general. So now going back to the food security indicators for Burkina Faso now in particular. So the top row of this column is copied from the previous slide, which showed these results for all African regions, but now this is particularly Burkina Faso. And then the lower, so the top row is the tariff reductions only, and the bottom row is also including the irrigation expansion. We have food prices decreased then significantly because of increased domestic production. The share of food expenditure in total disposable income also decreases, although it still increases compared to the baseline. And food consumption per capita increases as well. We have also a slight decrease in disposable income per capita, this comes from that the disposable income is the value of total private consumption. The total private consumption volume does increase, so this is more to do with the prices, the decrease in prices of the commodities consumed. Further looking at the impacts of the tariff reductions and the irrigation expansion in Burkina Faso, as I mentioned before, you have this leads to an increase in consumption. This is then consumption volume as opposed to value. An irrigation expansion leads to further consumption volumes across the board. There's a higher demand for all products as a result of the tariff reduction. So the price of production increases to meet this, and the price of production decreases significantly for primary agricultural products as a result of this irrigation expansion. The price of production of industry and services increases slightly, and this is because of the bottom right table shows that labor and capital then are pulled more into the agricultural processes, agricultural production as a result of an increase in irrigation, and then which is away from industry and services, because land is much more productive under this increase in irrigation scenario than the demand for land, and then the use of land decreases. I'm not sure if this has been mentioned before, but Magnet uses a land supply curve. So the land isn't fixed. The total amount of land isn't fixed in these scenarios, but it can increase slightly or decrease slightly depending on the price. So the demand for land decreases, the price drops, and so then the amount of land utilized drops slightly as well. And finally, what does this all mean for emissions? So the top left table shows the emissions in 2030 in the business as usual scenario, million tons of CO2 equivalent for Burkina Faso, the African continent, and the world as well. We have here that unlike Africa or the world, Burkina Faso is much more agriculturally focused, and more emissions actually come from agricultural activities than from industry and service, from the non-agricultural activity. And then again, primarily from livestock. The reduction, the tariff reductions lead to a slight increase in livestock, and that's the slight increase in primary agricultural production, and it leads to a decrease in crops. This increase in the irrigation expansion scenario then increases crop production, particularly, as I mentioned before, rice. And rice is a large emitter of methane. So this this increase in rice production also increases the greenhouse gas emissions significantly. So,
2 minutes, Jason.
Thank you. I'm almost done. The bottom right table shows the percent change in emissions for the AfCFTA for both the FCFTA with and without the irrigation expansion. This is then compared to the business as usual. So you see that the irrigation expansion has a significant increase in emissions from crops, where they decreased without this irrigation expansion, and this is because also crop production decreased in the scenario without irrigation expansion. So these are the interactions that that's important to take into account when evaluating the impact of the AfCFTA on these different areas. So people become richer. Food consumption increases. There's a higher demand for food, which then increases food prices. In certain regions, Burkina Faso being one, this also then increases the share of income spent on food. So interventions such as increasing irrigation infrastructure can then increase production and reduce food prices. But this also then, particularly as this increase in irrigation primarily affects rice, has a negative effect on greenhouse gas emissions. And as greenhouse gas emissions come primarily from agriculture in Burkina Faso, if they're going to make a shift to a more greener economy, they have to focus further on agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, which would then, depending on how those interventions are structured, also affect food prices and producer prices. So yes, that's what I wanted to say. And these interactions are important in designing policies that would go alongside of the AfCFTA. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jason, for your presentation. Very interesting indeed, and touching actually quite a complicated area, no? All these interactions, how we can understand how one will impact the other. It's more toward the kind of holistic approach we need. So, Jason, we have time for questions for a discussion session of about 10 minutes. So are there any questions for Jason? We have a first one from Kentin Onionu. No, sorry for the pronunciation. So what is the expected GDP growth positive in SADC area, SADC area, and EAC, and negative in COMESA, when COMESA is the set of these two regions?
Yes. All the regions that I present, thank you very much for that question. That is, I expected something like this. All of the regions that I showed, and in fact, I will show this again, are mutually exclusive. So the names can be a bit deceiving. Share my presentation again. Can you all see the presentation? Yes. So this is the map of these regions with the colors and the names. So the names were chosen to best fit the region, but they are all mutually exclusive. So there's not that one is contained in the other. So yes, that can be a bit confusing.
Yeah.
Thanks for that.
I think it's clear. Other questions?
There was a question right before that from Charlotte as well.
Yes, thank you, Ginger. Yes, from Charlotte. Thanking you for the interesting presentation. Do you observe a change in the food consumption pattern under the trade scenario, the African trade scenario? For instance, a change in the share of high-value products, animal products, fruits and veg, processed products, etc.
I have to say, I haven't looked at that specifically, but as people get richer, then there is a shift more towards these. Yes, you would expect that. I'm trying to think particularly. Yeah, no, I haven't looked at it within the agriculture sector. No, I apologize.
Okay, Charlotte, are you happy with the answer?
Yeah.
But by the way, Charlotte, we cannot see your family name, and I don't know if you want to take.
Hi. Yes,
the
sorry.
floor. Would be nice when we hear each other. Also, that you say from where you are. I mean, where are you working?
Yes, I'm working at the University of Leuven, Belgium.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't have my last name. I somehow forgot and I can't adjust. No, I asked because maybe I was wondering whether this could explain the increase in the food price you have in your scenario, that maybe because of the change in which crops are traded or are available, which maybe is a higher share of the high value crops, and then this increases the average food price. But yeah,
we do have these income elasticities, which then, as people get richer, it does shift their consumption patterns in general, and we have this implemented, of course, for the baseline. As Africa gets much richer, so it's the for the countries that have an additional benefit of the tariff reductions from AfCFTA, then yes, you would absolutely expect those small changes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Nice to meet you. So, any other questions? Well, then I don't see any other. Ginger, I'm also under your control because I might miss something, but I think no. So we can smoothly maybe go to the next presentation from Victor Nikifor from the Joint Research Center. And he will tell us something with a focus on Kenya. Victor, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you see the slides. It's fine.
Yes.
Okay,
I can see.
You.
Maybe
okay.
I don't see full screen, but
you don't see full screen.
Yeah.
If you click under display settings, you can switch the presenter. Yeah, it's the first option there.
Right
there you go.
Okay, now that's perfect.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, today I'll talk a little bit about the impacts of the AfCFTA on Kenya. So running a country level analysis. This study is conducted by myself and Ole, Emanuele, and Antti, my colleagues from the Economics of Agriculture unit, the GRC, but also in collaboration with Martin Wafula and Joshua Laichena from our collaborators from Kenya, from the Kipra Institute. So I'll not talk a lot about Magnet, although it is connected to that, because it is basically an exercise of trying to transpose the Magnet results that you've seen in the first presentation that Antti did into a country CG model. I will focus more on the country level approach. So to talk a little bit about Kenya, it's one of the largest, it's the 6th largest economy in the African Union. It's been experiencing a strong and steady growth in the past decade. Despite this, its economic structure hasn't really changed that much. And in the bottom right graph, you can see that basically the GVA allocation by sector hasn't really changed significantly. On the trade side, Kenya is a net exporter on the African continent, so it exports something like 35 to 45%, 37 to 45% of exports go to African countries. Most of them are in COMESA, so the free trade area it's part of, but only imports 8 to 11% from the African Union, depending on the year. And again, here in the top left, top right graph, you can see that again the shares haven't really changed very much in the past decade. Now, in relation to the AfCFTA, I won't do any introduction about what it is and when it will come into force, but all I can say is that we still don't know exactly what the tariff offer of Kenya, the offers are, but these will be submitted together with the other countries in the EAC, and Kenya is part of this regional economic community. In terms of commodities to look at for intra-African trade, it exports tea, iron and steel products, paper products, oils, and then on the import side, it imports maize, paper products, sugar, and vegetables. This is just to give a bit of an introduction to the context of the Kenyan economy and trade. Now, when running an economy-wide analysis with an interest to determine the impacts at the country level, there are several approaches. Here you have 3. Considering the AfCFTA is a multilateral, multi-regional trade agreement, unusual suspect is using a global CG model, such as Magnet. And as we might know, is that there are a few challenges regarding the country level detail, especially in Africa. So some countries may be aggregated into a larger region in the GTAP database that's underlying the global CG model. There's also an issue of commodity aggregation. Household disaggregation is also an issue because you can't really, since you only have one representative household, usually you can't really say much about the distributional impact of trade agreements. And this is why in the literature we find global CG models coupled with poverty microsimulation to be able to say more about the poverty incidence of trade agreements. Another avenue would be using a simple country level CGE, and the rationale is to be able to use a larger and more up-to-date social accounting matrix, or something that really reflects the latest information about the economic inputs and outputs or economic structure of the country. One challenge with that is because it would be a country level focus, you're missing out a lot of the details around, the behavior of the other countries. So you don't have export demand shifts unless you get this information from other parts. So the third approach would be basically a combination of the first two, and we found these in 2 previous studies. So one by Horridge and Zai, and then in 2006, and Boyson et al. In 2016, focusing on Uganda. So it's basically integrating results from the global CG model and then transposing them into a country level CG. And this is basically the approach we took, being also mindful about the limitations of combining data of 2 models that may have different model structures, but also diverging data that's used to calibrate them. So the methods we use exactly the magnet results that you've seen in Anti's presentation, first presentation of the session, and transpose them into the Metra model, the GRC Metra model, which is a single country CGE. To give a background, it's an extension of the stage step model. For Kenya, where we're calibrating the model using a 2017 social accounting matrix, using the full disaggregation of 55 sectors, 22 household groups, which are divided across agricultural zones and urban and rural segments, and then also these households also have labor endowment, so you have 24 different labor segments, which are then implemented in the model in production functions as with sector-specific wages. Also, we did a bit of work on the SAM side since SAMs don't really have NTMs. At the beginning, we re-estimated, recalculated the SAM by including the revenue generating NTMs and the calculated tariffs for Kenya. And I'll talk a little bit later about the NTM inclusion in the simulations. The model is run in a dynamic recursive setting. So from 2017 to 2035, there's a baseline that's constructed again based on the SSP2 GDP growth rates. In terms of model closure, it's a savings-driven model. And then an important dimension is the government closure. We opted for fixed government borrowing just because we wanted to isolate the impacts of the changes in tariff revenues and government revenues in case they drop. We didn't want them to be transmitted to the investment side. But instead, we opted for a flexible government spending, whereby public administration spending adjusts based on changes in income of government following the implementation of the AfCFTA. In terms of the linking of the two models, we follow the methodology from Forage and Zai, whereby on the export side, we use, from the magnet model, we use the prices and quantities to calculate an export demand shift, which is then implemented in the Metra. And then on the import side, we're taking only the price information and also the iceberg NTMs, which are then implemented in the Metra as productivity shocks in the Armington specification. And by doing this, we then allow the Metra flexibility in determining the export demand, so the equilibrium, which is driven by an export demand that's downward sloping. And on the import side, the response of the model is driven by an Armington specification, in which we use the GTAP elasticities to try to align ourselves as much as possible with the magnet specification. So this strategy, for this strategy, we also considered alternatives. I will not have probably time today to talk about the outcomes of the alternatives, but you have some slides at the end of the presentation, which is online, to compare the model response, where instead of having this demand shift of export demand shift that we're implementing in the Metra by including prices and quantities, instead of that, we were looking at fixing export quantities and allowing export prices to be flexible. So we reached the conclusion that this initial first method of the demand shift leads to better results, and you have some outcomes in the annex. The scenarios, again, they're very similar to Anti's presentation. We're considering 4 different liberalization schedules. One of them is, well, the government, the government tariff revenue maximization, which is calculated a priori, so before these tariff reductions are actually implemented in the model. And then 3 other liberalization schedules, which have secondary policy priorities. You have AGR for prioritizing agricultural and food commodities, and for intermediate input products, and RCA for prioritizing commodities with real comparative advantage. So these central alternative liberalization schedules, they come with a few variations. So we consider both tariff-only reduction and tariff plus NTM reduction. And this is, again, conducted exactly the same way as in the other global, the continental level study, where we reduced the NTMs by over 15 years. NTMs are included as a mix of both rent generating and iceberg costs, as Antti described before. And then to make our simulations a little bit, to bring them closer to the policy making in Kenya, we also consider some form of government intervention, whereby to address falling tariff revenues of the government, which might translate into a falling government income, we also endogenize a sales tax to compensate and to thus obtain revenue neutrality for the government. And we will see the results of that. Moving on to the results, here you have some plot points with the effects over GDP and welfare by 2035, aggregate welfare, that is. We see that without the NTM reduction, well, the GDP impacts are quite negligible, and we do obtain, sorry, I'm just going to add laser. Okay, so the effects are quite negligible, but then we have a 1% increase in aggregate welfare. There's a visible impact of the addition of the NTMs. The GDP impacts go in the region of 0.4%, and then welfare gains increase to 4%. And here we start seeing some slight differences between the liberalization schedules, and we have the best GDP outcomes for the schedule which favors intermediate good trade. Then when we are looking at our fiscal instrument to compensate for a drop in tariff revenues, we see that this comes at a cost. So both GDP and welfare drop. And we see in both tariff only and tariff plus NTMs that there is about an 0.2% of GDP cost of implementing this fiscal instrument. And also this implies that with this sales tax, we enter the negative territory for GDP outcomes in the tariff-only scenarios. Moving on into the welfare impacts, we separate the rural and urban households. We see that, and here you also have a bit of the transition to 2035, so 5-year time steps. We see that rural households represented as box plots here, they have a gain in welfare, which is in both tariff only and tariff plus NTMs, with very few household groups that have a negative impact in the short run. And this expansion basically comes, as we will see, comes from higher trade of cash crops. And then moving on to the sales tax, the fiscal instrument, we see that there's the slight decrease in welfare gains. And another thing that we observe is that as we move from 2025 to 2035, the size of the box plots grow, which means that the regional differences of the between the rural household groups grow over time in both with and without sales tax variants. For the urban households, the story is a bit different in the sense that we see a lot of negative impacts in the transition to 2035, especially in the tariff-only reduction. And this is less well, to a lesser extent in the tariff plus NTMs. But here what we see that the moment we add the sales tax, we have some benefits of also reducing the differences between the different urban households, but also bringing more households from the negative welfare impacts into the positive territory. So here is, besides the positive effect on government income of adding the sales tax, it's a positive outcome in terms of improving the transitional welfare impact of negative impacts of urban households. On a sectoral level, we see, again, some differences between the tariff-only and tariff plus NTMs. With just the tariffs being eliminated, we see that there's a boost around the agri-food sector, so cash crops and processed foods are the ones that are growing the most. We also see as a first sign of a decrease in government revenue, and here, due to the closure rule we adopted, we see a drop in spending in public administration, so we see a negative impact here. And then when we moved into NTMs also being reduced, the spectrum of sectors that are seeing a gain in output broadens quite a bit. So the effect is less pronounced this time for cash crops and processed food, but we see gains in other sectors like manufacturing, the extractive sector, extractive industry, and also the underlying sectors. And on top of this, we also see that the tax also changes a little bit the distributional impact over the sectors. Okay.
2 minutes, Victor.
Yes, I will wrap up. On the aggregate side, on the trade changes, again, we see differences between tariff only and tariff plus NTMs. So the trade grows by much more when we include NTMs. So this is not a surprise considering also the other presentations. We see that on the import side, we see a lot of growth on the food crops and processed food, which means the Kenyan households will consume more of the imported kind. And on the export side, again, what's interesting is to see that with the NTMs, there's also a diminution of exports in the manufacturing and processed food and extractive industry. So again, the message of diversification of trade on the export side when the NTMs are included. Government income, just to say that without the sales tax, we do see a net negative impact on government revenues for both tariff only and tariff plus NTMs. But to obtain revenue neutrality, the sales tax would need to increase by about 4.5%. This is applied to all sales. But nevertheless, we see, and we don't have a graph for this here, but the CPI, even with the sales tax included, is still below the baseline. So, you know, and consumers will see a drop in prices even with the sales tax. Conclusions. We clearly see that the results are highly dependent on whether we decide to reduce the NTMs or not. With the NTMs reduced, we see a liberalization schedule, which is favoring intermediate goods as being the one that provides the largest GDP benefits to Kenya. In general, we see the AfCFTA impacting positively exports of cash crops, mining products, manufacturing, and services. And we see food crops production decreases due to higher imports across all the four liberalization schedules considered. And another, the aspect regarding the fiscal instrument, the sales tax to compensate for lower government revenues due to lower tariffs, reduces the GDP indeed, so it comes at a cost. However, it shows that it acts as an alleviation to the transitional period where urban households experience some negative welfare impact. That was all. Thank you very much. Looking forward to your question.
Thank you, Victor. Excellent presentation. We have some spared minutes. Ginger, confirm me if I'm not wrong. So I would propose that first we start with some questions with Victor, and then if you have any general question for any of the speakers to come back to some of the presentation. And also I would also propose that you show up when you pose your questions. So we have the pleasure to see you and to also to know from you where are you from and shortly from which organization you are part of. So let's go. Are there any intervention? Question for Victor? I have a question myself, Victor, that I might ask you during our job time, but I will do now. So it's about the integration of Magnet, then GTAP and the Metra, no? So for Kenya, you did it for Kenya, but what are the specific issues that would make it more, let's say, extendable to other countries? And what is can you explain again the value added of integrating with another model, the magnets? I suppose this is the aggregation. The first one is the aggregation, no?
Well, the most important aspect of using the continental level information is to see how bilateral trade changes between other countries as well. So you can say more things about trade diversion, which you can't really say if you employ a single country CG. So absolutely, you need a multi-regional view on this. So I guess that is the most important advantage of integrating the two models. On the challenges side is just about having two different models with two different sectoral disaggregation, but also specification of behavior, which would make them react differently when some specific shocks come into place. And for this analysis, we see, and you do have the slides in the appendix, that the Metra model reacts more than Magnet when it comes to trade. So you will see more imports and more exports compared to the GTAP results. So this is one of the challenging, trying to reconcile the trade outcomes of the two models. But the advantage of using a country level CG is, being able to fully endogenize different household groups and have a complete relationship between consumption, production decisions, and income and welfare, as opposed to more of a top-down CG micro-simulation type of approach.
Okay. And the difference, let's say, sensitivity to trade of the two models are explained by specific parameters or elasticities, or is more structural to the model?
It could be, obviously, it could be related to the trade elasticities and also production functions, differences, elasticities within the production functions. Could be a number of things.
Okay, thank you, Victor. We'll have time to discuss more bilaterally on all these aspects. Other question from the audience? Okay, a question from Honor. Honor, would you like to show up and make the question? So we have also the pleasure to see you.
Hello, Professor. Do you hear me?
Hi, Honor.
Hey, so my question is, like, when I check the slide 4, I think, so as the calibration 22 household group, What's that mean? And 24 labor segment. So as far as I know, so using single model, we have only one household, or how we create 22 households? Thank you.
Well, this is very much specific to the social accounting matrix that we're using for Kenya. On the agricultural side, but also on the household side, there are 8 different regions which are structured around agricultural zones. Within these regions, for each you have, well, at least for 6 of them, you have rural and urban environments, so different households within those. And also you have, in Kenya, you have 2 metropolitan areas, which are Mombasa and Nairobi. And for those, you have households divided by income quantile. So this is why you see here a mismatch between the number of household groups and labor segments, because of this metropolitan detail on income. And for each region in urban and rural areas, you have a division of labor by skilled, semi-skilled, and not skilled segments.
Okay, thank you both. Any other questions?
I see that Adwell Zimbele has his hand raised in the participant panel. So Adwell, if you have something to ask. Oh, there, he just entered it into chat.
Yeah, I can see now. Adwell, you want to make your questions directly? You want to show up? Okay, so yeah. Yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Prof. And thank you very much, Victor, for the good presentation. Yeah, I am looking at your recommendation on the need to reduce the NTMs. And my question is, do you think is all the NTMs that are trade limiting? Somehow there is a general feeling that some NTMs may be enforcing trade. Now, when you are making a general recommendation on reducing the NTMs, how do you reconcile the two views? Thank you, Prof, and thank you, Victor.
Thank you for the question. Well, regarding the NTMs, the way they are transposed in both in the global model and country level CGEs is that they are calculated in terms of as an ad valorem equivalent, and that the values are taken from other studies, which implies that well, since they have an ad valorem equivalent, they are introduced as costs to trade in the model, so not necessarily favoring trade, but the other way around. So if they are indeed NTMs which favor trade, they will not be captured by this ad valorem equivalent. This is not really my area of expertise. My colleagues might have a better view on this, especially Ole. I think he's around. I don't know if he wants to add anything to that, to NTMs that could favor trade, stimulate trade. I don't know, Ole, if you want to add anything, or if you're there.
Yeah. Hi, Victor. Thanks. Yeah, I suppose that's an interesting question. I don't have any concrete examples in my head for more trade promoting NTMs right now, but I have read about the issue too. But I think it's only a few such measures which really have such kind of effects, and yeah, of course we wouldn't really include them here. I mean, they are probably hidden in the estimates of the NTMs, but because the negative impacts on the trade are dominating in those, we just don't see them in these NTM estimates we have used from the World Bank. Thanks.
Prof, can I come back?
Yes.
Your permission?
Sure.
I'm
Ahead.
thinking
Go
about
ahead.
I'm thinking about NTMs like the SPS. That's the ones that promote the protection of the health of the consumers. And when the consumers see that they are better off or they are well taken care of in the products, they would be able to demand more of those products. So I should think that one would be like it's an NTM that is giving confidence to the consumers, thereby promoting trade in that regard. So my question was in that case, when we are recommending a GNO reduction, how do we reconcile the concerns of the consumers? Don't you think the consumers will become worried that now they're not very sure about their safety as they are consuming those kind of goods? So that's the idea of NTMs that, in my view, would be consolidating trade. And we need to take that into consideration, in my view, as we are coming up with these recommendations and the general conclusions. Thank you very much. That's what I was thinking. Thank you.
Thank you, Adwell. I think it's a good consideration because there are always counter effects of any decision, and indeed this could be also generating, say, confidence is an aspect from the consumer point of view. But I don't know if some of the speakers would like to take the lead for an answer or adding some comments to Adwell. Or we just take, yes, Caitlin.
Maybe I can add some comments. I think that is correct, and I would agree with that statement that it is the SPS measures, which are often the ones that could promote confidence. And I think there are certain models. Terry Wamsley, I think that was a couple years back. She had presented one, though she's also having a seminar next month, along with Anna Stretch, on looking at modeling NTMs, and they are considering this new modeling mechanism where you can explicitly capture sort of this benefit of certain NTMs. So that's one thing that I wanted to mention. But then I wanted to mention it's twofold, right? So you could say that these SPS measures are beneficial in a sense, in the sense that they promote consumer confidence, and so there could be more demand. Yet at the same time, if you don't have sort of corresponding regulations for SPS measures in different countries or in different regions, this is still going to be a barrier. So it's not it's not to say that if we have certain SPS measures, is this promoting confidence? Yes, it can be promoting confidence, but it can also act as a barrier if you might meet SPS measures in your region, but you still have to be able to meet SPS measures in another region. And so in that sense, there's still this additional cost to meet those other SPS measures. So I hope this might sort of add some context. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. We also see in the chat that there is a contribution from Honor, from Ginger, on websites and other documents that we can review on the subject. Thank you to all. And Victor, before wrapping up, there is one last point, a question from Charlotte directed to you about the policy implications for the Kenyan government. So, Charlotte, you would like to rapidly go with your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering because you found a reduction in the food crop production, but many governments in Africa rather aim for increased self-sufficiency or higher food, like reduced food import dependency. So I was wondering if your results then point that this is not necessarily a good strategy to pursue, or what's your input on that?
Well, I think one aspect that would need to be considered is that we are basically, well, with an economy-wide approach, we have a closed system sort of thing where you have a fixed amount of labor and capital and land, etc., right? That's available within a certain time frame. And from the results, you saw that food crops are going down, but cash crops are increasing. So necessarily, there's a reallocation of the resources that economy has. So, and then obviously, if other policy objectives overlap with the AfCFTA effects, obviously you might want to do something about it, such as stimulate productivity for food crops. That is something that is prioritary, which might prevent some of the imports from coming in. But there will always be this trade-off, right? There's only so much you can produce.
Yeah. Thank you.
Giampiero, you're muted.
Thank you. It's time for me to rapidly wrap up. And thank you for this interesting discussion. Unfortunately, we have to stop here. And special thanks to all the speakers, of course, all the participants, the co-authors, some of them are here, some others not, but basically they were all super well represented. So my take rapidly, the first is about the modeling. So magnets showed that it is a powerful tool to approach magnet and GTAP, because the core is GTAP, showed to be a powerful tool to look at these complex issues, which is this complicated free trade agreement and the effects. And we have also seen from Kathleen additional module, because it's a modular system, the one on the harmonized system that is helping the analysis. We have seen also how it can be, let's say, coupled with other models from Victor in order to even stress results and go more in details. And what is my general take on all the good results you obtained is that they are quite encouraging. They are all going in the sense that these trade agreements will generate wellness, will generate jobs, with some attentions from what I could see. Of course, there are some local vulnerability, like also Antti mentioned, and we have to pay attention to some specific local policy areas, like it was also questioned by Charlotte now, because say the general continental effects, then a local level might be different. And also the importance of this, let's say the nexus as shown by Jason, and also the interaction between among the different sectors in terms of impacts. For instance, I have in mind one of his conclusions that increasing the manufacturing may pull away resources from agriculture. And the session was looking at the food security, within this trade analysis. And so this is also a point for all of us as a researcher to advise in the right way our decision makers on the effects and the way to go. So thank you to everybody. Also special thanks to Ginger for having hosted us and making possible the session. And I know that the session was recorded, so I don't know, maybe this will be available later on in order also to come back to the presentations. And there is also a last contribution from Emanuele Ferrari on a link in the chat about the NTM's debate. So thank you again to everybody. Have a nice continuation with this wonderful Congress.